I have been using the Canon EOS R5 Mark II for wildlife photography for about a year now, and I've taken lots of pictures, amongst others the picture of the great snipe here that I took in Norway. And in this video I want to talk about my long-term experiences with this camera after 1 year. And I structured the video in the way that I want to start with 5 things that I really like about the camera, 5 things that are meh, and 5 things that I really don't like about the camera. So if you're considering to buy an R5 Mark II, maybe upgrading from your old R5, I hope that this video is helpful for you. Let's start with the positive things, and the first of it is the stacked sensor. So we have a much faster readout, and this means that rolling shutter is greatly reduced, and it also has some other benefits. For example, the blackout of the viewfinder is not there anymore. We have a blackout-free viewfinder, and this makes tracking birds in flight, especially small and fast flying birds, so much easier. Additionally, it also allows us to set in or dial in shorter shutter speeds, and with the R5 Mark II we can now set a shutter speed of 1/32,000, so it's 2 stops of more light that the camera can still somehow process in this sense, because we have a shorter shutter speed, and that's very useful in bright situations with fast lenses. For example, if I shoot backlit with some bokeh in the background, I was really happy about having this shorter shutter speed. The next thing that has a bit to do with the stacked sensor is the 30 frames per second and the pre-capture that we have. For most situations I was perfectly fine with 20 frames per second. In fact, I still have my R5 Mark II set that it shoots in 20 frames per second by default, and then only with the press of a button basically I switch to 30 frames per second if I need it. The third thing that I like about the R5 Mark II is the improved autofocus. In my opinion, it's still one of the best on the market right now, and it's especially pronounced when you have a subject that is rather small in frame. It grabs it much better than the original R5, and you also have much more flexibility. So now you can not only select the subject detection or bird detection from the whole area AF, but also basically from any autofocus area you can select, from spot autofocus to single point to the expand area, zone, and the whole area, and this gives you much more flexibility. And in this example here of this deer, the camera would not find the subject if I went for a large zone or the whole area. However, if I activated the single point autofocus with subject detection and tracking, it still managed to detect and track the deer. So this was quite cool. And if you want to learn more of how you can adapt your R5 Mark II or R1 autofocus system for different situations for bird and mammal photography, then check out my ebook that I wrote about the autofocus of those 2 cameras. Obviously, I also do a lot of video work, and here we just have much more options. We have some small changes like the full-size HDMI and this red tele lamp, but more importantly maybe we have different codecs that are more efficient. We have more settings with the log settings of the camera. And we can now also shoot slow motion with sound, which is greatly, which I really like. We have pre-recording in video, and also the anti-flicker shooting, which without this function I could not shoot in this room with these LEDs behind me. Maybe not very relevant for wildlife photography, but what is relevant for wildlife photography is the improved image stabilizer that I noticed especially in video mode. The last positive point that I want to mention is that the camera just seems smoother, and I don't mean only the shape of the camera, it's just behaving, or it's more responsive. So what you can do with basically all Canon cameras is that you can put that on one press of a button, you switch to a different shooting configuration. And with the R5 I always was a bit disappointed that there was a small lag when I pressed this button, and this is now gone. Also, my R5 crashed several times over the years, and with the R5 Mark II in this 1 year I cannot remember that I had a single crash of the camera, so it just seems faster, smoother, and more stable. To the bit more neutral points, or the ones where I have mixed feelings. First of all, rolling shutter. As I mentioned, it's greatly reduced. If I pan with a bird, the trees in the background are now not crooked anymore, they're straight, so it's fast enough for that. However, and I don't know why exactly, if a bird is flapping the wings, especially like a small bird, like a snowfinch in flight and things like this, sometimes I can still see in the wing movements some horizontal lines. It's definitely better than with the R5. I would say the R1 is still a bit better, so this is intermediate. So yeah, I think there is still a bit of room for improvement, but not too bad. The second thing is the IBIS. So as I mentioned before, the IBIS really improved, and I was actually surprised how much you also felt the difference in the IBIS when shooting with a telephoto lens. I did not expect this, but I was very happy. The problem that I noticed is that the IBIS got mostly improved in the center of the image. Of course, all IBIS work better in the center of the image, but I was a bit surprised how big the difference from center to the corner is. And I was taking some landscape pictures, and I was happy that I could handhold like 1/3 of a second, and thought, okay, I don't even need to take my tripod, and okay, this is my fault, but only at home I realized that the corners of the image were not always sharp, even though the center was. So just be aware of that. The next thing is that overall I like that you can now customize the camera more. We have some new functions, for example, focus, preset and recall. You can do it on the camera, which is great if you use a lens such as the RF 100 to 500 that doesn't have dedicated buttons for focus and recall, focus set and recall. However, I think it's still a bit limited what you could. I would enjoy having a focus limiter like OM System is giving it for years, and since summer Nikon also announced it in the Nikon Z8. The Canon R5 Mark II also features this eye-controlled autofocus, so basically that the autofocus can go wherever you look. And I think it's implemented very nicely. I used it in the beginning, but to be honest, I kind of stopped using it, because you need to put it on a button. I mean, you cannot have it active the whole time. This doesn't work properly. You can put it on a button. The thing is, I could not use it as often as I wanted. For what it works great is just to move the autofocus point quickly around. It's much faster with a joystick. Less precise, but much faster. My main problem is that obviously it only works when you're using the viewfinder, and I realized how often I'm just laying somewhere and then using the tilt screen, or I need a different angle and I shoot like this over the tilt screen, or even if I need to like somehow shoot between bushes and I have a bit of a weird position, the camera can obviously not, or the viewfinder of the camera can obviously not detect my eye properly anymore. And also in vertical it worked less reliable for me than in horizontal. So it worked okay-ish, but there were just not so many situations where I could use it, and then I decided that since the buttons that you can configure on this camera are kind of limited, I prefer to have one configured for something else, which namely is actually the focus, preset or recall. The last neutral point is the image quality, and I know there have been a lot of discussions on the internet that the image quality is worse than the R5. In some situations, yes, it is. In some situations, it's better. To make it very short, it's better when you are in many situations at lower ISO when you're using the electronic shutter, but it's worse if you use the mechanical shutter. For wildlife photography, most of the cases I use the electronic shutter and at higher ISO, and there the difference is really not that big. So overall, that's for me pretty much a neutral thing. The things that I don't like so much on the R5 Mark II, or would have wished for some more improvements, is first the display. I would have liked if it had a different mechanism. I mean, I like that I can film myself like this, but if I take pictures of waterfowl and I look on the view on the screen like this, the problem is that I'm not on the optical axis, so it's a little bit harder to find the bird, and I think the Sony and Nikon cameras have it much better. Overall, I still prefer this Canon implementation over the one that Nikon has with the Z8 and Z9, but I think Sony just has the best one on the Sony A1 Mark II and A9 Mark III, because you can basically move it in every direction and always have it on the optical axis. Next thing very similar is the viewfinder. So I would have wished for a larger viewfinder. The viewfinder of the Z8 and Z9 Nikon are already noticeably larger, and the one of the Sony A1 Mark II or the Canon EOS R1 are just a whole other dimension. And yeah, I would have wished for a small step up. The viewfinder looks much bigger on the outside, but this is mostly just because of these infrared sensors that it has for scanning your eye, for the eye-controlled autofocus, but the magnification is not bigger. That being said, it still looks better. It's somehow a clearer image. I compared it also with some friends and they were also confirming that the image somehow looks nicer. The next thing is about the card slots. So very much like with the Canon R5 or also the Nikon Z8, we have one CF Express and one SD card slot. Personally, I would like to shoot redundantly whenever possible, and this is not really feasible if I have an SD card because it just slows down everything too much, especially if I shoot action. I agree, or I acknowledge that on this price level, as we can also see with the Sony A7R5 or the Nikon Z8, it's just not common to have two CF Express card slots. But what I would have wished is either a bit larger buffer or having at least the CF Express card slot a bit faster, because you can use the CF Express type 4 cards, but you don't gain anything compared to a slower CF Express type B card. So yeah, maybe a hint here. I would go for a cheaper CF Express type B card because you will not notice the difference in terms of buffer or anything in the camera if you go for the most expensive card. I link the ones that I used below. Also related to the memory card is the startup time of the camera. That kind of gets slower and slower the more you fill a card. And this is not a problem if you have a small card like 128 gigabytes, but with a 512 gigabytes it's really noticeable, and with 1 terabyte card it's not better. So the camera just takes longer to boot up, or if it goes in standby mode, it again takes longer to get reactivated. And this is annoying, and I already found myself in a situation where I formatted the card even though there was still sufficient space on it, but I just formatted it with 200 gigabytes still free because the camera would get snappier again. So I hope maybe there is somehow a firmware solution for that. Finally, the last thing that I really hate is the photo video switch on the left side. I don't know who thought about that this would be a great idea, but with the old camera I could with the press of one button switch between photo and video mode, and now I cannot do it anymore. If I'm shooting wildlife with a long super telephoto lens, I effectively need to go down, change the camera, go up again, and with this I can spook the animal. Maybe I just lose the focus completely. It costs me time, I could miss the scene. It's a nightmare. The only workaround that I have is to program one video function on the record button, but this is a predefined function that is saved there, so it's not ideal for all situations, and it also starts recording immediately. It's not the same as switching into video mode, and frankly I would have preferred if the on-off switch would have stayed on the left and we had another option for choosing between photo and video on the right. So if we could switch these, or instead of the lock that I never use, if we have off photo and video, so that you can switch with this one between off photo and video mode. So to summarize, the R5 Mark II is not a revolutionary camera. The R5 was the revolutionary camera. I think this is an evolution, and if you do a lot of action photography, I think you will really enjoy the better autofocus, the stacked sensor, 30 frames per second, and the pre-capture in some situations. If, however, you do more landscapes or maybe taking pictures of smaller or slower moving mammals or birds, then you could really save some money by just grabbing a used R5, or maybe just sticking with the R5 that you already have and invest the money into a photography trip. If you want to pick up the R5 Mark II, I linked it below. I would be curious to hear about your experiences with the camera, and please also check out the autofocus ebook that I mentioned before.